My lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the noble Lord Seeker, who has just delivered what I can only describe as a bombshell of a speech. It's a speech that makes the case for the extraordinary importance of this amendment and for a far broader clean-out of the Augean stables of our financial sector and its so-called regulation, and indeed our entire UK system of government. So a reminder that Amendment 33, which I rise to speak, creates for the FCA a duty to make a statement about ministerial directions on investigations. In the name of the noble Lord Seeker, also signed by the Right Reverend Prelate, the Lord Bishop of St Albans, and I was also pleased to attach my name. Just a reminder about the key part of the speech we've just heard. On the 30th of May 2017, possibly in response to previous invitations, the Thames Valley Police and Crime Commissioner wrote to the Prime Minister saying, I quote, "There is a serious problem with bank governance, which appears to be corrupt at the highest levels in a number of our banks, major banks. The governance system itself is being run by those most involved in cover-ups and corrupt practices." That from the Thames Valley Police and Crime Commissioner. And yet it appears that nothing has been done in response to that letter. I note also, as the noble Lord Seeker said, that despite an initial offer of the meeting, the late Sir Jeremy Hayward subsequently declined to meet the Police and Crime Commissioner. So who should be paying attention to this? I would say everyone in the UK and indeed the world, for it might be more than a decade since the threat presented by this financial sector to the security of us all was made so starkly evident. But the threat remains and is undoubtedly greater now even than it was in 2008. Among those who should be paying particular attention, I would strongly suggest, are all of those who've been assuring us in this House and elsewhere that everything's fine, nothing to see here, just a few bad apples being cleared out. People have been saying there's no problem with regulation or transparency or the risks that the financial sector presents. I would suggest they should pay attention to the noble Lord's speech. Now, the House has heard my views before on the deep-rooted, decades, indeed centuries-old issues with our financial sector. And I'm not going to repeat those which I explored at some length in the committee stage. Instead, I want to focus in this stage on the issue of for the financial sector as a huge global crime issue, as a major United Nations initiative is recognised. I'm referring to the high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda, the so-called FACTI panel, which is calling on governments to agree to a global pact for financial integrity for sustainable development. What they're doing here is reminding us that while we often think of white-collar crime and fraud as a victimless crime, in fact, it's a crime that damages the whole of the world, but particularly the poorest and most vulnerable, both in the UK and around the world. Now, this FACTI panel, consisting of former world leaders and central bank governors, business and civil society heads and academics, says as much as 2.7% of global GDP is laundered annually, while corporations shopping around for tax-free jurisdictions cost governments up to $600 billion a year. Now, we've been hearing often in this bill and elsewhere from the government in particular about how prominent the UK financial sector is on the global stage, its world-leading role. Well, there can be no conclusion from the FACTI report except that that is directed very clearly at the UK, at your Lordship's House. Now, the FACTI panel says that stronger laws and institutions are needed to prevent corruption and money laundering, and that bankers, lawyers and accountants who enable financial crime must also face punitive sanctions. The report also calls for greater transparency on company ownership and public spending, stronger international cooperation on the prosecution of bribery, to which this is particularly relevant, on minimum corporate tax, of which I was asking a question last week, and global governance of tax abuse and money laundering. So previously in the debate in this bill in committee stage, I also referred to the report from the Centre for American Progress, not necessarily an organisation with which I often ideologically agree, but it was making very similar arguments to the Facti panel. I'd invite any noble lords with an FT subscription, which is indeed all of us through the library, to look at stories tagged financial fraud, which makes a very sober set of reading. So, my lords, we are in a situation where action is needed. We hear very often about the need for the UK to be world leading. But I want to reflect back on, and I know this was before the pandemic because it was a meeting in person conducted upstairs from your lordship's house in one of the committee rooms. I had a discussion with a group of University of Michigan master's students visiting with their professor, and they were in Europe to study fraud. Indeed, their entire master's degree was in fraud and corruption and examining the scale of it around the world. And I said to them, pointing down the road from your lordship's house, to say that that's one of the global centres of corruption, the City of London. And I was perhaps not surprised, but still interested to discover that there wasn't any expression of shock or surprise from those students who were studying fraud and corruption around the world. They simply nodded in agreement, like I'd made a statement to them, blindingly obvious. We're in a situation now where the City of London has been trading on its global reputation, centuries of propaganda, backed for much of that time by the muscle of colonial power. The world has moved on, and it's less and less likely to believe the propaganda. This amendment is a simple, modest, and far from sufficient step, but a very important one to ensure that we have transparency of the governance of our financial sector. Indeed, transparency of our governance. I commend it to your lordship's house. Thank you, my lords.